Welcome. Today, we are diving into the chemistry of the most essential substance on Earth, water. In this explainer, we're going to be following the IGCSE environmental chemistry syllabus to really understand this vital compound. First, we'll look at how chemists can actually identify water and test if it's pure. Then, we'll uncover some of the hidden substances that might be lurking in our water sources. And finally, we'll follow the incredible journey water takes to become safe enough for us to drink right from the tap. So let's say you have a clear mystery liquid. How do you prove it's actually water? Well, chemists have a couple of really clever tricks up their sleeves to figure this out. The very first test uses something called anhydrous copper 2 sulfate. Now, anhydrous is just a fancy word that means without water, so it starts out as a pretty unassuming white powder. But just watch what happens when you add water. A chemical reaction kicks off. The water molecules literally grab onto the powder, creating something new called hydrated copper 2 sulfate. And bam! The substance transforms from white to this brilliant, unmistakable blue. Now, for a second really crucial confirmation, we can use anhydrous cobalt 2 chloride. This chemical starts out as a distinct blue color when it's completely dry. And just like our first test, when it comes into contact with water, it undergoes a pretty dramatic transformation, changing from blue to a very noticeable pink. So you've got white to blue or blue to pink. Either way, those are the telltale signs that you're dealing with H2O. But, and this is a big but, here's the catch. These tests only tell us that water is present. They say nothing about whether it's pure. So how in the world do we test for purity? To figure that out, we can't rely on a color change. We have to look at its physical constants. You see, a pure substance has a fixed, sharp melting point. And for water, that is precisely 0 degrees Celsius. Not close to it, but exactly 0. And it's the exact same story for boiling. Pure water has a precise boiling point of 100 degrees Celsius. If your sample starts to melt below 0 or boils above 100, or if it happens over a range of temperatures, then you know for sure there are impurities messing with that perfect structure. Now, let's take this idea of purity and see why it is so critical in a real-world chemistry setting, like a school or university laboratory. In a serious lab experiment, you would never use regular tap water. Why? Because it's full of dissolved minerals and chemicals like chlorine that can completely interfere with a reaction and totally invalidate your results. That's why scientists rely on distilled water, which is exceptionally pure. This diagram shows you exactly how distillation works to get that high level of purity. You start by boiling the water, which creates steam, but all those dissolved impurities, they can't evaporate, so they get left behind. That pure steam is then cooled in a condenser, turning it back into an incredibly pure liquid. So what exactly are these impurities we keep talking about? I mean, when you look at natural water sources like rivers and lakes, what's actually in there? Well, it turns out water in the wild is this incredibly complex mixture. On one hand, you have beneficial things like dissolved oxygen that fish need to breathe. But on the other hand, you have some genuinely harmful stuff like toxic heavy metals from industrial waste, plastics, and even raw sewage, which is just teeming with dangerous microbes. You know, agricultural runoff is a particularly nasty problem. Nitrates and phosphates from fertilizers wash into rivers, and this causes these huge blooms of algae. When that algae eventually dies, it gets decomposed by bacteria, and that whole process consumes massive amounts of dissolved oxygen from the water. It's called deoxygenation, and it effectively suffocates the river, killing fish and other aquatic life. So this brings us to probably the most important question of all. If our natural water is filled with everything from toxic metals to sewage, how on earth do we turn it into the safe, clean drinking water that comes right out of our taps? Well, it's a really clever, multi-stage process designed to tackle each problem in order. First up, filtration. We use things like sand and gravel beds to remove all the solid bits and pieces. Next, the water flows through active carbon, which acts like a giant sponge to absorb anything that might cause bad tastes or smells. And finally, the most critical step of all, disinfection. And this diagram here shows that whole incredible journey. It really is a masterpiece of engineering and chemistry. Water gets pumped from the source, passed through screens and filters, and then it undergoes those final chemical treatments before it's stored and sent out to our homes.
And I really can't stress this enough. Chlorination is the final and most vital safety check. It's what kills any remaining bacteria and viruses, protecting us from really deadly waterborne diseases like cholera and typhoid. Seriously, without this step, our taps would be a source of constant danger.